All right, so let's get the show on the road. For those of you who don't know who Knock Knock is, we are a company that really focuses very deeply on the notion of authentication. We bring a deep background in people who've done PKI work, PGP, encryption, a lot of interesting work in this area, particularly related to privacy. And we were one of the people that set up the FIDO Alliance, one of the original 5, and articulated some of the principles behind FIDO, and have some of the largest implementations out there. So we're in a good position to talk about what FIDO does and doesn't do, what it was not intended to do, what the areas it doesn't address, how it works with some of the areas. And so we thought it'd be a good idea, given that some of FIDO's now arrived in an interesting way, to start talking about what's a little bit beyond. So I was very lucky a few weeks ago to be at the Marconi Awards ceremony. For those of you who don't know what the Marconi Awards are, it's like the Turing Awards, but instead of winning an award for theoretical computer science, you win it for applied stuff. So some of the honorees are people like Robert Lucky, Len Kleinrock, Marty Hellman with Diffie, and the award ceremony was to honor 2 friends of mine and colleagues, Paul Kocher and Tahir El-Gamal, for their work on SSL. And I think most of you recognize that the world we know wouldn't exist without SSL. It's become part of the foundations, just like the work that Diffie-Hellman did has become a part of our foundations. And Jim Clark interviewed these 2 guys on stage, and a lot of the discussion was about some of the successes, why SSL was successful, what was unique about it. But we also talked a lot about the areas that SSL failed in or did not succeed so widely. And one of those areas was really, while SSL does a fantastic job of allowing you to have some confidence that the entity on the other side that you're talking to, particularly a server or a service, is the legitimate entity, it failed when it came to the user. And so there was a lot of discussion about passwords and end users and entities. And in a sense, really that was one of the things that we set out to solve with FIDO. And so this slide basically encapsulates a very interesting dinner table discussion that we had with some of these guys that are people that built the foundation of the internet that we live on today. So there are 3 essential questions that you have to ask when you're dealing with a remote entity, right? And these 3 assurances, to the extent that they fulfill what you're seeking in them, will allow you to establish a firm level of trust. And when you don't receive an appropriate level of trust, then you're required to compensate. And a lot of our lives, unfortunately, over the last 2 decades has been about compensation, because these 3 assurances that we are seeking, am I talking to the right user? Is this user on the right device? And am I talking to this user in the right context? And because we keep failing in this area, we've had to compensate. I like to say that authentication is a game of signals, right? And the problem is that when it comes to these 3 areas, the user, the device, and the context, we've basically been dealing with weak signals. And what that means is we go out and do silly things like scrape as much data as we can and hope that it protects us. Risk systems will say, oh, I'm dealing with 100 points of light here, right? I've fingerprinted the device, I've done this, I've done that. The problem is that most of those signals are spoofable, some trivially, some are a little bit harder. And so what you do is you keep the dumb crooks out, but the sophisticated actors sail in every time. And so our motivation in setting up FIDO and going in that direction was that a lot of stuff that we do in user space is kind of spoofable, attackable, and we really need to start doing this stuff in sequestered environments that allowed for a greater level of assurance and trust. And most of you are familiar with this slide. I'll give you a couple of nuances here. Everybody understands that passwords are crappy for the reasons that most of you have gotten familiar with. I think most of you are probably still not deeply acknowledged how vulnerable our current MFA infrastructure is, right? I think Neinart in his talk talked about what 10% penetration in most enterprises of MFA, right? Terrible number, and so that's the best that we can do, and that unfortunately still requires your end user to make a distinction between a good request and a bad request. And so if there's one thing you want to go tattoo on your shoulder someplace, anything that you deploy that requires an end user to make a distinction between a good request and a bad request is bound to fail, right? And so we have a infrastructure that's based on passwords, OTPs, that's terrible, and that 10% number tells you that maybe, you know, some of this OTP token stuff should be even further to the left in terms of usability, right? Because it really hasn't made very far. So we designed FIDO as a way to not do any one specific method of authentication, because people are going to use, in some sense, things that they're used to doing every day and comfortable with. And we tried to make something like SSL that was pluggable. It's an open standard. It's not about any one specific method of authentication, but the most important thing was to make it resistant to scalable attacks, and phishing is a scalable attack. If you guys haven't read the PhishMe kinds of information, go look at the economics of what it costs an attacker today to run a phishing attack on your enterprise, and you'll be shocked, right? The numbers are what you've got in your pocket right now for spare change, right? And so if the best that you can do is under threat, you know, how do you manage all of this? So, you know, most of you perhaps will have attended a FIDO seminar at some point in the past, or looked at one of the FIDO protocols, or maybe even played with some code. But here are 5 key concepts that I want you to make sure you walk away with when you think about FIDO, right? As I said, authentication is a game of signals. Well, one of the first principles of FIDO is, can we strengthen the signal that's coming from the user and coming from the device? And we were very fortunate because, you know, most of you look old enough to remember a time maybe about 5-6 years ago when if you wanted to do any kind of crypto in hardware, it was either a proprietary API, it was expensive, and it had a toll gate, right? So the idea of doing crypto in secure hardware that mere mortals have access to wasn't there. And one of the things that FIDO's done for you is basically given you a high-level abstraction layer to do authentication-related computation with crypto in hardware. Okay. All right. So we are also, as I said, one of the main goals was to prevent scalable attacks. If you haven't ever looked at the threat model for FIDO, Rolf Lindemann, who will follow me here briefly, is one of the co-authors of the 2 protocols, WebAuthn and UAF, and has done a really nice job of putting that threat model together. And I'd really urge you guys at some point as practitioners to go look at it. The goal was to make it easy not just for the end user, but easy for the developer, because your developer is part of your security posture, and they get things wrong. They don't understand details like trusted execution environments or secure elements. You got to fix that. And then you have to make it easy for the operator, because the more infrastructures that are distinguished that you have in the back end, the more likely you're to screw up. So FIDO gives you a simpler single API, high-level abstraction, single backend. Because we've gotten used to scraping these signals, we've ended up with this idea or notion that user privacy and your security, user privacy doesn't matter. Well, FIDO makes it possible to not treat these things as orthogonal, right? It is a privacy-respecting protocol, and it gives you lots of interesting ways to stay out of trouble and stay off of the front page of the Wall Street Journal when one of your vendors leaks all of the data that it's been scraping from your users' devices. And then if you don't know what an authenticator is, it is not a fingerprint sensor or a token. It is an abstraction, and it is probably the heart of what FIDO is. And if you don't understand it, go read about it, come talk to one of us, and it really is what brings it all together. Okay, so this is a flashback to 2012. I did this triangle to disambiguate what FIDO was up to and what we were doing and what we were not, more particularly, what we were not trying to do, right? So this is a flashback to 2012. I call it the in-scope, out-of-scope kind of problem. And we said, look, guys, we're trying very tightly to focus on this problem of authentication. When it comes to user management, identity proofing, these are not things that we can take on, right? It's impossible to go build a universal standard in this area. It's too hard. We want to keep things clean. And so we focused on strong authentication. And now it's 2019, and the world is interested in authentication, and everybody says they're doing authentication, and authentication is being used, the word's being used everywhere. Maybe ID Pro will help sort of clean up some of the terminology, but for the moment, you're going to get dozens of people walking up to you saying, hey, I do authentication, etc. So let me try and sort of set up at least a couple of differences that you can carry away with you. So when you do ID proofing, whether it's to set up the account or for account recovery, typically you're doing it infrequently. You're doing what we call classic authentication, which is a domain of FIDO. It's typically once per session or once per a set of sessions that you're doing the bootstrap of this user into a session where you're doing it once per data transfer, right? And so these are sort of three different domains of usage where you would think about authentication as the thing that you're up to. And all of the stuff below are all the little tools that you would use, whether you do in-person proofing or you do claim sharing of some kind through knowledge-based stuff, you do channel-bound cookies, and each one of those methods comes with a level of assurance associated with it, depending on how easy it is to defeat by an adversary. And so here's an example. You might bootstrap a user into your system saying, hey, can you give me some knowledge-based assurance about who you are? You might hand them a one-factor kind of thing like password, and then you might feel very proud of the fact that you've used channel-bound cookies in order to secure the session. And unfortunately, what's going to happen is that your overall assurance is going to skew towards the lowest assurance level that you've used to bootstrap into the system. Right? There's still some interesting reasons to use stronger methods of authentication, but in general, you're going to skew towards the lowest method there. So here's another example where, in regulated industries that deal with consumers or in-house employees, you might deal with a relatively high level of onboarding and ID proofing. But then if you go off and you hand them a method of authentication where the end user has to make the distinction between a good request and a bad request, what do you think is going to happen? Well, your assurance level has actually gone down from where you started out, right? FIDO obviously has an opportunity to change some of this. It works with some of these other areas of authentication. I'm going to let Rolf talk to some of that.
Great, thank you. So let's see how FIDO changes that picture, right? We are still in the same picture. You see the level of assurance vertically. You see the frequency of usage in the horizontal axis, right? And in FIDO, you essentially get a bump upwards, right? If you look into authentication today, you typically do the one-factor thing, the password thing, not that often because passwords are a pain, especially if users have to enter those on let's say, smartphones, right, with touch screens. But the second factor thing, right, the second factor thing is something you want to do even less frequently because this is really a pain, right? And so we somehow do put it more to the left and say this is something you want to avoid. And we kind of got used to that, but it's still relatively weak. Now what we heard in the session before here was get rid of that 2 in the 2FA. It's essentially, right, don't distinguish the first factor and the second factor, but make it a single thing, right? And that's exactly what FIDO does, right? We are still a two-factor method, but it's not a first factor plus a second factor. It's a single two-factor method, which makes it much easier to do, right, on one hand side, because entering a password, I don't know, it might be 20 keystrokes in the end, or hits on your touchscreen with all the things. Putting your finger on a fingerprint sensor or putting your face to a camera is a single gesture, right? That's much easier. It's much easier to do for users, and so you have the ability to do that more often, right? With that, doing that more often, you can somehow do the slightly push to the right-hand side, right, more frequently, so you reduce the reliance on the session management side because the sessions get shorter, the things you need to really protect, right? And second, you get a bump upwards, right? You push the confidence level much higher because FIDO in the end is to a two-factor method which is not phishable, right? Which is not vulnerable to server-side stealing attacks and all these things. So you gain a lot of security. You could argue that, yeah, maybe that's not a single security level. That's right? FIDO is not defining one specific security level. It's just you gain a lot of minimum security just by using FIDO, but then it depends on the kind of authenticator you are using, right? How much key protection you have, how is the user verified, how much anti-spoofing or presentation attack detection you have in that authenticator, and so forth, right? So there's some variability in that thing. But in the end, it means push upwards, right? And you can do it more often, and it's still convenient for the user, right? For example, once you open the app, you ask the user to re-authenticate, and for a banking app, that's still okay, right? People would still say, yes, that's a good user experience, where with two-factor authentication, and the second factor is nothing you want to do whenever users open the app, right? So that's one thing. Now, in general, you need a balanced security profile, right? As Rajiv has mentioned, if you have one weakest link, that limits the overall security, just making the session management very secure, when on the other hand, keeping the, let's say, ID verification or validation very low and the authentication very low doesn't give you anything, right? It's just a waste of money on the session management side and a waste of complexity. So in some areas, you can already, with the use of FIDO and the token binding, right, the strong cookies, you can reach a balanced security profile if you are lucky and you are in an area where you either can do in-person proofing, or you are in a country which has electronic ID cards, right? Which makes that claim sharing in some way so easy and so secure that it's really practical to bootstrap that identity securely. That's not always the case, right? But at least that's this balanced security profile. That's your goal. That's what you want to get into that. And if you look what today's systems do, right? You see on this screen, the Y level has now, the Y-axis has been changed. It's now the level of complexity, right? Today's systems typically tend towards an overly complicated session management system, right? Where we have to compensate the weak authentication and the weak ID proofing, and we try to somehow have more risk signals. It's still weak, but we have those signals, right? Because that's the best thing we can do. Now, with the use of FIDO, we get into a situation where we balance it a little out, right? So we help you reducing the complexity of the session management system now, because you get fewer signals but much stronger signals and less noisy signals, right? It's the number of contacts might help you, right, in a signal to identify that user or recognize that user again. In the end, it's a very noisy signal and it's not very strong. So having FIDO and cryptographically bind those signals to a device is much better and gives you much more assurance on the end. So that's something you gain on the session management side. On the ID proofing side, it's interesting to see that it really depends on the vertical you are in, right? Let's assume you are in the cloud storage providing business, right? It's just I don't know, some people upload their files and later on they can recognize the files, right? Do you care about ID proofing? Not really, right? Whether that person is John Doe or the so-called dog on the internet, you don't care, right? The person uploads data, and as long as you can recognize that person, right, that person will be confident using your service and everything is fine, right? On the other hand, if you are in the e-commerce business, right, not really regulated entity, but you have some more need to understand who's on the other end of that line, and you can still build a kind of reputation over time if you use strong authentication over the time, right, after a relatively weak identity proofing, right, and after 2 years you have built a stronger reputation and you get there, right? But in the end, what we do in FIDO is make sure we say the ID proofing is out of scope of FIDO, right? We stay on the authentication side and provide you a clean conceptual interface to this is the identity binding you have to do, right? And this helps you to understand and make it obvious what ID proofing can do and it has to deliver for your system. So the third thing we have now been doing is, which FIDO helps you, is authenticating users to IoT devices, right? Typically, when you think about FIDO, it's about users to remote servers, right, which are far away. but there's a lot of similarity in the user-to-device authentication. We want to get rid of the passwords because it's just too many devices users have to authenticate to. Just without any authentication method doesn't work because secure perimeters don't really exist anymore. We have learned that over the course of time. So that was one additional thing the FIDO Alliance can do for you. And in the end, FIDO is a protocol. It's not an entire solution. So if you think about deploying that, you need more than just the specification. So you need to think about all the relevant use cases. How do you address those use cases? And is that a solution you have in mind ready for doing that? Plus, in the end, you have to come up with a project to get funding for, to really do in reality and to do that deployment. So you have to break it down in phases typically. And what we have learned with our customers over time is that in very many cases, a mobile-first strategy works, right? Reduces the scope. You get a reach of more than 90% of your customer base, right? It's something you can do and get you a clear benefit, right? You want to drive your mobile app adoption anyway, so that's a good thing. Next step could be directly driving authentication through the browser and finally get to now you can deprecate the passwords and the OTPs altogether, which gets you to the passwordless world, whereas even the first steps is for some users, right, which are into that, already is a passwordless experience, right, which is great and gives you all the security benefits. And we have seen that the adoption is really substantial, right? Rather than today's adoption, if you look into most providers, I think it's more in the 10% range, what people use in terms of two-factor authentication. With those things, you can get to 50%, 60%, and even above that adoption in a very short time frame, and I think that's a very beneficial situation. So quick takeaway is FIDO is really ready for prime time. So if you think about a two-factor method which is convenient for your users and is adopted by your users, think about and get on FIDO. And I think that's a good situation. And by the way, the FIDO Alliance has recently launched 2 new working groups, a technical working group for IoT and a non-technical working group for identity validation, just to make sure we understand how exactly those worlds go together.